Good evening. Thank you very much again, Professor Jordanova. Well, it's a pleasure. Do you remember those times where we have a cycle of colloquios which were called pleasures and obstacles? Well, this is a pleasure. Well, we send you the profile with the CV of our invited speaker. So just remembering that she is Emeritus Professor of History and Visual Culture at the Department of History in Durham University, and also Honorary Professorial Fellow at Edinburgh College of Art at the University of Edinburgh. Well, and she has written extensively on history of science, medicine, gender, family, public history, museums, portraits, contemporary art, and the use of visual and material sources in history, and so on. But in this presentation, I would like to highlight 3 aspects which I have observed and I am interested through her many writings, but especially in her books, Sexual Visions, History in Practice, and The Look of the Past. So, the first aspect I want to highlight is the interest of Professor Ludmilla Jordanova on the educational concern with students. And some of these books I have mentioned are thought for students of history. And well, this morning, I think that we have enjoyed a great morning. And I want to thank Professor Jordanova for sharing with some of our PhD students her knowledge and experience. I am sure all of us this morning have learned about the practice of history, about how historians do and how they do their job. I really appreciate your didactic way of making questions and your inquiry sense, forcing to reflect historically and paying continuously attention to put our sources in context. The second question I want to highlight is interdisciplinarity. Professor Ludmilla Jordanova trained first as a natural scientist, then practiced as a historian, with a special emphasis on modern history, history of science, cultural history, and visual arts and museology. And in the last years, she has lectured as professor of visual culture. Moreover, Professor Jordanova is part of the trustees of the Science Museum Group and works regularly with contemporary artists. So, this open-mindedness attitude is perhaps behind what she describes as my ideal is an integrative form of history. It's not about quantity, but about bringing a range of types of evidence together meaningfully. And this means a mixed and comparative use of text, images, and objects as arguments that are to be turned into historical narratives. And finally, in our research group of the history of scientific collections, the writings of Professor Ludmilla Jordanova have been particularly useful, stimulating, and provoking in so many ways in order to understand images and objects as socially products and not as simple documents or passive reflections of our reality. For instance, through the practice of description. Description understood as the pathway to elaborate an interpretation, so making connections and engaging with sources. The historian acts as a mediator or translator, and also from the need of understand historically the different ways of seeing, representing, and making. And that means to pay attention to the social context of production, exhibition, and reception of visual and material evidence. I think this is of paramount importance to understand complexity, and that means complex social relations, and to build arguments in a written form for making a book, an exhibition, or a documentary film. So now we can check some of these points through her examination of the collection of the Royal College of Physicians in London. So thanks, Professor Jordanova, for accepting our invitation. And please, now it's your turn.
Thank you very much. So, well, thank you for your very kind introduction.
See you later.
Yeah, I'll see you later. And I've got my paper here. So, first of all, I'd like to offer my warm thanks, and especially to Alphonse for the invitation to speak to you, and it is my pleasure and my privilege to do so. So what I'm going to do is start with some examples from the case study around which this talk is built, to provide a sense of both the materials and the setting that I have been working with. But my first slide is a staircase. But this is not just a means for people to move between floors. This is the carefully conceptualized centerpiece of a magnificent building in London, a piece of modern architecture of great significance, opened in 1964 and designed by Dennis Lasdon, who also worked on these well-known buildings: the National Theatre in London's South Bank Centre, which is from the 1960s, late 1960s, and the ziggurats at the University of East Anglia, built between 1962 and 1968. So when he was asked to design, or when he won the commission to design the College of Physicians, he was surprised because he was not an obvious choice for such a venerable institution as the Royal College of Physicians, which was founded in 1518. For much of its history, sorry, I think I meant to stay on that. For much of its history, it regulated medical practice in London. Now it has a broader remit and an international membership, playing a major role in professional accreditation and development, and also in health policy. For more than 500 years, it has occupied a prominent place in London life and boasts many august fellows, such as William Harvey, to whom I shall return. Physicians, but also physicians to the royal family, and many figures who were significant for the life of the nation, and not just in medical worlds narrowly defined. And this man is a neat example of this. This is Lord Moran, who was Winston Churchill's doctor, and published, highly controversially, an account of his famous patient not long after his death. Moran was, in other words, a public figure. Now, when Lasdon was employed to design the new building, he undertook considerable research in an attempt to understand the college and its history. The building thus embodies and expresses his grasp of a long-established institution. So to return to the staircase provides hanging space for paintings in the surrounding corridors and walkways, and it also provides room for processions. Sorry. Lasdon comprehended, in other words, that rituals, collections, and display were central to the identity of the organization. And on this slide, the wall that you see in the center, portraits are always hung, so the one that has 5 portraits on. Although the hang itself changes from time to time, with an increasing emphasis on, for example, women fellows and presidents, perhaps to compensate for their late admission to the college, which was in the 20th century. The other side of that wall is the so-called Osler room, and it provides another space for hanging portraits, although the number of spectators is necessarily smaller in an enclosed space rather than in one for circulation. And you can see in this slide how halls and walkways are hung with portraits. So I think they're unavoidable in this building. Other areas display portrait busts as well as paintings. So a modernist structure thus gives prominence to historic collections. Now, what I've been doing so far is just setting the scene. And so let me now turn to 3 specific examples of collecting and display in the college before stepping back for a bit of reflection. And my first example is one you saw just now. And this is perhaps the most precious object in the collection. I don't mean in terms of monetary value. I mean in terms of the emotional value with which the people in the organization invested. So it depicts, it's a portrait by an unknown hand, and the date of the painting is also unknown. So it clearly depicts William Harvey in old age, and so was presumably made in the 1650s or late 1640s. Although very occasionally moved for special exhibitions, its usual home is in the Dorchester Library. So its usual home is in this room in the Dorchester Library. And I'm intentionally showing you quite a lot of images from the website of the college, because I think this gives us a very good insight into how they project themselves to wider audiences. So you can see that despite the very big screen at the end, the Harvey painting is visible, and that they're always emphasizing the historic value of the collections. So this is, as you can see, a large book-lined room where many meetings and conferences are held. While it goes without saying that Harvey is a preeminent figure in the history of science and medicine, we nonetheless need to tease out the reasons behind his quite exceptional, perhaps even unique status. So although by no means uncontroversial in his lifetime, his discovery of the circulation of the blood has been recognized as of fundamental significance for both medicine and the natural sciences. It earned him a global reputation, much adulation, for example, from his biographer, Geoffrey Keynes, a place in accounts of the so-called scientific revolution, and the status of a revered forebear for later experimentalists in the sciences, such as Thomas Henry Huxley. Harvey's name is on hospitals, schools, and clubs. He had notably wide intellectual interests and was admired for his deep learning. However, the main reason, I think, or at least one of the main reasons behind this portrait's high status is the paucity of authentic images of him. Many portraits exist that claim to show Harvey, and here's one in the Royal Society, which I think it's absolutely clear that this is not an authentic portrait, but I checked the website and it's still presented in this way. But detailed research, above all by Geoffrey Keynes, whom I mentioned just now, who was actually a surgeon, not a physician, has whittled it down to a tiny number. In some sense, then, this portrait is an icon. What it stands for is uncommon intellectual achievement, with both scientists and medical practitioners eager to claim Harvey as a venerated predecessor. Accordingly, institutions for which he was a central figure may claim referred glory. Now, Harvey was never president of the college. He declined the honor, but he was a prominent fellow, partly by virtue of his royal appointments and his learning, and a benefactor to the college. And this, which is his pointing stick that he used in lectures, remains as a relic in the collections of the college. So that's my first example. My second example is rather different. With Harvey's demonstrating rod in mind, I now turn to a walking stick, the famous gold-headed cane, although I'm not sure that it was ever actually used as a walking stick. So this is the cane. This is generally on display in what is called the treasures room, along with other prized artifacts in the college's possession, which is adjacent to spaces used for conferences. And that's not the case that the walking stick is in, it's the one on the other side of the room. Now, this item was given to the college by the widow of the last owner, who was a man called Matthew Bailey. This is Matthew Bailey. So it's possible to trace its ownership through 5 previous physicians, Radcliffe, Mead, Askew, and William and David Pitcairn, whose coats of arms are engraved on the head. And I think you can just see that in the slide. But it is its literary life that makes it an object of special interest. William McMichael, who was a physician-writer, who acted as a censor at the college and as its registrar, wrote a book in the voice of the cane, recounting its experiences of its owners. First published anonymously in 1827, and then in several subsequent editions, it is a much loved and much commented upon book. The conceit here is that the cane was able to make privileged and direct observations about past medical life that could be shared with readers. It was, in other words, a way of writing about medical biography and medical practice from a special and valuable vantage point. Furthermore, the work was illustrated, and most of the works that are illustrated come from the college's collections. And this is just one example. But actually, this is very interesting because this is a piece of china made by a Chinese artist who was in London in the 18th century. So it's extraordinarily rare, perhaps unique. So we are, of course, thoroughly familiar with the ways in which portraits are arrayed on walls, with books as a major additional vehicle for the dissemination of likenesses. Now, central to this book, the illustration of which you're seeing here, are the relationships between the owners, as well as between owners, patrons, and patients, so that the cane is a vehicle for accounts of lineages, professional associations, shared passions, and acts of homage. Because it accompanied its owners when visiting patients, the cane offered intimate glimpses of medical life that would not otherwise have been available. Now, I hope it goes without saying that much of this must necessarily be speculative. That is, it was made up by McMichael. When reading it, however, when reading this book, one becomes caught up in the conceit and indeed the excitement of learning what went on behind the scenes. So this book portrays medicine as central to public affairs by virtue of the prominent figures these physicians attended, and by virtue of physicians as mostly exemplary men. So that's my second example. But my third example is an entire room, the so-called censor's room, recreated from the college's earlier homes in the heart of a modernist building and functioning as a kind of time capsule. So this is the room as it looks now. Or, as the website puts it, a symbolic gateway to an ancient institution. As you can see, busts and portraits adorn it, and the furnishings are manifestly traditional, so unlike any other part of the building. The room is clearly a vehicle for display as well as being an object of display itself. And it works as an ensemble to convey the deep historical past of the college. Indeed, I would say that the room is a collected object. And you can see an earlier version of the room here. Because it is a complete environment, it can be especially eloquent. So visitors are immersed in the past, although, as you can see, the room is not hung in precisely the same way now. The hang now, if you remember there, is much simpler than there. And I think this is because of broad changes in styles of display. Arguably, this room is the symbolic heart of the college, not least because it bears testimony to a central function that it undertakes, and that is examining candidates for the fellowship. And this was established, I think it says on the slide, at the very beginning in 1518. And this is just the modern one again. Now, in fact, the room was originally built in 1675, so it does not go back as far as the original foundation, but it has been carefully moved from one building to another over the college's history, thereby representing continuity of function over close to 350 years. So those are my three examples to start with. And at this point, I'm just going to step back briefly and to take stock of what kinds of historical insights a detailed study of a medical institution might generate. So in this section of my talk, I'd like to explore the nature of case studies such as this, and then to reflect on the role of visual and material culture in institutions. So, of course, the Royal College of Physicians in London is unique. There are independent colleges in Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Dublin, for example, as well as comparable organizations of surgeons and of a number of medical specialties, each with their own history and defining features. And making careful comparisons between them, I think, is worthwhile. So detailed case studies are an essential starting point for such comparative work, which obviously has to consider both what they have in common as well as what sets them apart from each other. But few of the others are as old as the London College, and few have its close connection with royal families, a significant source of status for the organization, I suggest. This is not a very fashionable area in the history of medicine, but I think the possibilities for looking at this are absolutely very, very extensive. And I've been quite surprised when I was doing this work that I couldn't find more secondary literature on this question of the relationship between, at least for the UK, between doctors and the royal family. And I think they, it's been a very, very important part of this organization. And indeed, actually, a recent president of the college was the physician to the Queen. And it's also the case that the London collections are notably extensive, especially when it comes to painted portraits. And I don't know if you're aware that there's a website in the UK where you can see every painting that is in public ownership. It's called Art UK. So every painting, unless there's some reason for it, not copyright reason, for example, you can see no matter what body owns it, if it's owned by a public entity. But also in the college's collections are drawings, prints, photographs, medals, books, and manuscripts, as well as some quite specialized collections, such as silver, apothecaries' jars, and the accoutrements of medical practice. So a case study dwells on particularities, but the term usually implies that a detailed example will bear on some larger historical issues. For example, in this instance, these might include the role of the state, patterns of professionalization, and the status of practitioners. And I'd like to suggest that one such issue is the role of material and visual culture in institutions. That is, how collections and display go to the very heart of prominent organizations and their modes of functioning. So that rather than being seen as merely status-seeking and status-affirming, it's possible that institutions' collections and styles of display can be interpreted so as to shed light on their core values and practices in fresh ways. Now, these are historically shaped, by which I mean not just that they were formed in specific contexts, but that the hand of history is present, visible, and celebrated in them, shaping their characteristics. Thus, items of visual material culture that might be seen as ceremonial or decorative are capable of being interpreted in more complex ways that are perhaps best summed up as pertaining to individual and collective identities. But they cannot perform such work without being displayed and in a range of forms, and we cannot apprehend the ways in which they work without paying attention to the precise details that historical actors were familiar with. So what I'm basically arguing is that people, over the history of the college, people understood the collections in their own ways, and that as historians, we need to try and recover what those ways were. And in the little book I wrote for the college, I talk a lot about families and about networks and about people sharing interests, for example, in book collecting, as ways that we might give back some life to these collections. Now, I think that in the history of science and medicine, we remain rather anxious about hagiography, which is seen as part of an older, discredited historiographical style that lauded winners and chided losers. It was prone to heroizing a limited number of individuals and to promulgating an uncritical march of progress as the essence of historical narrative. Now, that traditional mode of discourse is certainly present in most institutions, which celebrate their own and act as gatekeepers of who deserves praise and who will be made marginal for later generations. However, these are all historical phenomena worthy of investigation in their own right, and it's not our job as historians to castigate such ancestor worship, but to grasp how, when, and why it occurs. And if, as seems undeniable, all institutions do this, it is helpful for historians to understand the processes and the impulses involved. Thus, rituals, for example, can become objects of interest for us, occasions for blending anthropological and historical insights, opening up the possibility of comparing scientific and medical institutions with a broad range of legal, political, occupational, and educational organizations. Many such entities, perhaps all such entities, celebrate their forebears, commemorate benefactors, incorporate processions into their most important activities, and dine together. Now, I'm not in a position to offer you such a broad account this evening, but I can draw your attention to an example from the Royal College of Physicians in London that could form the basis of such a study. And based on my personal experience of attending this event, it exhibits some common features and some distinctive ones. So here is my example, which takes us back to, sorry, I meant to show you that about the censors. So this is my example, the Harveian oration. So each year, the college holds a Harveian oration and dinner. And as you can see, this takes place on or near St. Luke's Day. It was endowed by William Harvey himself, who promulgated the guiding phrase that you can see on the slide about searching out the secrets of nature. It begins with a procession into the lecture theatre with robes and symbols as portrayed in this election day procession. So I don't know if you can see, there's a mace and a caduceus, and the president wears these quite distinctive robes. So this happens to be taken the day of electing a new president for what is now a 4-year term. So the lecture that is given, as it were, in honor of Harvey, but is now mostly about a contemporary scientific or medical topic, is followed by a dinner at which a toast to Harvey is enacted. So it's a silent toast. So everybody stands up, but you don't say anything. So it's very, very ritualized. And at the same time, images of Harvey are projected onto the side of a building adjacent to Dennis Lasden's building and visible through huge plate glass windows. So this is my photograph. So this was before we sat down for dinner. And I think you can see that then there's this huge and really vast digital projection onto an adjacent building. So, of course, there are many forms of display here. Knowledge of nature and of the human body, close links with a towering figure, portraits, lineage and continuity, internal hierarchy, while in material terms, they range from silverware and robes to photographs, food, drink, and so on, which again complement each other to form a total experience. But none of this would work without Harvey himself and the precise reasons for his veneration, which I touched on earlier. Now, in certain ways, Harvey's achievements are somewhat abstract, such as the forms of reasoning he undertook in De Motu Cordis, 1628, his general orientation to natural phenomena, and his interest in experiment. On one level, these were practices, combinations of habits of mind, types of curiosity, and manual activities, but their implications were far-reaching and at times highly controversial. For example, Harvey has often been weaponized in debates about vivisection, and the mid-19th century statue of him in Oxford alludes directly to this practice. So this is there's a building in Oxford called the University Museum. It was built in the middle of the 19th century, and the central courtyard has key figures from the history of science and medicine all around it. And what Harvey is doing in this, in this statue is he is holding a pulsating heart in his hand, and he is measuring the number of beats. So it is unavoidable that there is a reference here to vivisection. And at the time that this statue was made, this was one of the most divisive and controversial areas in British society, I would say. Now, all the features that I've described indicate why he has been equally held up as a scientific and as a medical giant. And of course, I realize that this is a somewhat problematic distinction, but I think it's one of crucial importance for the college, since until fairly recently, its most distinguished fellows were successful medical practitioners who were politically astute, well-connected, and effective with patients, but mostly not scientifically minded. And it was actually not until the 1960s that the presidency was held by someone, I'm going to show you his portrait, Charles Dodds, who was a scientist rather than a clinician. And you can see him there with the molecular structure. It's a form of estrogen that he whatever we're going to call it, identified. Thus, for the rise of scientific medicine, no matter how one periodizes such a phenomenon, the college was actually somewhat peripheral. Indeed, the model of the learned physician was notably persistent, as was the association of medical practice with collecting on the one hand and literary accomplishments on the other. And I'd like to suggest that these actually endured into the early 20th century. So, in other words, long after we might think that the rise of scientific medicine has occurred. Thus, Harvey has enabled the college to make a number of useful and I think quite subtle cultural maneuvers, such as aligning itself with scientific experimentation and with innovation through an exceptionally significant discovery. So, one of the most persistent themes in what I've said, which is evident in all three of the examples with which I began, is what I like to call the presence of the past. And I might say that for the college, the past is not some fusty, long ago era, but an active presence in its day-to-day life, one that is furthermore income generating, since its heritage is strongly promoted to potential clients hiring spaces in the building. At the present time, opinions seem to vary quite markedly amongst fellows and staff about the value of the collections, even as the website extols the historical associations as part of its marketing strategy. In other words, the display of the collections brings economic benefit. Now, there are bound to be a range of opinions about whether specific items or even entire collections are worth keeping or not. The historicity is deeply emotionally meaningful to some and merely a marketing advantage to others. Now, I've observed that medical practice seems to have particularly encouraged the historical concerns of many its practitioners. Or perhaps we should say that an institution such as the London College provide a framework and incentives for such inquiries. And I think it should be a matter of great interest to historians when particular occupations manifest marked historical sensibilities. And collections and forms of display act as a focus for such sensibilities, even as they shape them. At the same time, precisely what is owned by whom and where it finds a long-term home are necessarily contingent matters. So I wanted to give you an example of this. So this work is a good example of the point that I've just made. It depicts William Hunter lecturing on the anatomy of the human body at the Royal Academy of Arts in 1772 by the German painter Johann Zoffany. I would guess that in monetary terms, this is the most important picture that they own. And like the cane, it came from Sophia Bailey. Here she is. They now have a portrait of her, the widow of Matthew Bailey, and he was the nephew and heir of William Hunter, who was himself childless. William Hunter's will was complex, with his collections going to the University of Glasgow, although he lived much of his adult life in London. And initially, he was a surgeon rather than a physician. And when he did acquire the MD degree, he became a mere licentiate of the college and not a full fellow. And there is actually some evidence that he was quite critical of the college. Thus, although many items in the collections came from fellows who felt a strong and direct affinity with the organization, others arrived after a more indirect journey, one that could hardly have been anticipated at the time the artifacts came into being. So I think this example raises an issue that needs to be acknowledged at the very least, and that arises in its most obvious form when it comes to art collections. We can explore it by invoking the notion of taste and acknowledging its ever-changing character. Now, it so happens that Zoffany, who spent much of his career in England, is a highly admired artist whose oeuvre, which is strikingly diverse, is held in high esteem, although he's not in any way a superstar artist. So I think this is one clear reason why Zoffany's depiction of William Hunter elicits considerable worldwide interest, because there's interest in the artist and in his body of work, which is, I think, absolutely remarkable. But I think it's not the only reason, and I'd like to suggest two more. First, I say here the scarcity of paintings from this period showing medical men actually doing something relevant to their occupation. But I should have said that I think this is the only example I can think of from this period of someone actually undertaking an activity that is core to their medical career. And the second reason, I think, is the interest in the Royal Academy of Arts in London, founded by Sir Joshua Reynolds in 1768, where Hunter was the founding professor of anatomy. So I put it in this way because I want to avoid anachronistic aesthetic value judgments. Nevertheless, the quality of what is collected is unavoidable, as is the subjective fluctuating nature of such judgments. And it seems to me we often have difficulty with the phenomena of collecting and display when we are out of sympathy, aesthetically speaking, with the objects in question. So what I've been suggesting is that there is contingency in what is collected and by whom, as well as in the kinds of value with which collections are endowed. And I've argued that much of the value is by association of one kind or another, whether this is in terms of subject matter or of ownership. So, for example, William Hunter, who was himself a truly great collector, owned a portrait of William Harvey. This is his portrait. And this is one of the few portraits of Harvey that has been deemed authentic. And this portrait was previously owned by a prominent fellow of the college called Richard Mead, also a prodigious collector and one of the owners of the cane. And he had both a print, this, and a bust made from his canvas. So by the time the work, this work, reached William Hunter's hands, it had accrued multiple associations, and these kept on changing and growing for later audiences with the ways in which Harvey was celebrated in the 19th and 20th centuries. So in this case, associations and rarity value are absolutely everything, and aesthetic considerations play little or no part in the value ascribed to portraits of Harvey. In the Zoffany by contrast, I suggest that an increasing appreciation of his artistic merits has promoted a sense of the value of the painting. However, perhaps because of its relatively small size and its elaborate, fragile frame, it is usually displayed in a rather inconspicuous position. And the same applies to this painting, which I'm just going to turn to briefly. So I don't know if you recognize that this is the man I showed you the photograph of before. So to my mind, this is one of the most interesting works in the college's collection. And it depicts the man I've already mentioned, Charles McMorran Wilson, who became Lord Moran. And it dates from 1951 and was painted by the fashionable artist Pietro Annigoni, who espoused old master techniques, approaches and techniques. Now, Moran, as I've hinted, was a major figure in 20th century British medicine, not least because he was president of the college for 9 years during the time the National Health Service was being set up. He had served as a doctor in the First World War and wrote a book about his experiences called The Anatomy of Courage, although this was not published until 1945. Now, he was widely perceived as an arch manipulator, and this is suggested by his nickname, which was Corkscrew Charlie. So I think because he was perceived as an arch manipulator, and because of this reputation that he had, this work has actually become somewhat marginal to the college's understanding or sense of itself. Now, most unusually, both Moran and Annigoni wrote about the experience of the other. I don't have time to talk about that, but I'd be very happy to say more in questions. I think it's a magnificent piece of painting, but it depicts an unpopular person in a style that we find anomalous since it is resolutely anti-modernist. Portraits of female presidents, I'm going to show you two. So this is the first female president, and this is the second female president. So portrait paintings of female presidents that are far inferior, I think, as works of art, are prominently displayed in order to demonstrate that the college has become more open. And it is as well to remember that the first woman became a fellow in 1935, and that in 1949, Janet Vaughan became the first woman to sit on the college's council, and it was in 1989 that Margaret Turner Warwick became the first female president. So this is the first one, and this is the second one. And then there's been one more since then. But, for instance, the current president is a man. So 3, it's not a great tally. So what I'm suggesting is that collections, commissions, and displays are ways of working through some key issues, such as gender. And I've shown you the portraits of the first 2 women presidents, which I think are pleasant enough, but no more. And I can point the point even more strongly. In recent times, long-established bodies have positively preferred rather routine, safe portraits, lacking the conspicuous risk-taking that the National Portrait Gallery in London, for example, is known for. And I just wanted to show you 3 examples. So this is a portrait. I don't know if you know about this. This is a so-called genomic portrait. It's made with the DNA of the man who led the British team to decode the human genome. And this is by Mark Quinn, you know, who's one of the most famous artists, I guess, at all. Very controversial work. This is Susan Greenfield, the neuropharmacologist, and this is one slide, one slide of thousands that morph into each other over about 15 minutes, and they're all construed differently, and some of them include as background the artist's brain scan. So it's a portrait of him as well as a portrait of her. And this, which I think is particularly interesting, so this is a portrait of the surgeon, Roy Kahn, by one of his patients who happened to have been a major artist. So all 3 of these are in the National Portrait Gallery in London, but you just do not see organizations like the Royal Colleges embracing this kind of artwork. So what I'm saying is I think this risk aversion is revealing. It signals a distance from cutting-edge culture and a default position to more traditional values. Portrait painters are commentators, for example, about idioms of femininity, even if these have to be negotiated with sitters and commissioners. Thus, it is possible to read collections and displays in a number of ways and at different levels, so as to link them into major themes such as class, race, and gender. And I use portraits to make these points because they are amongst the most highly prized items in the college's collections, and they are visible to all who use the building, although some are hung in offices while others are kept in storage. So you can't see all the collection, but you can see an awful lot of it. So such institutions, I think, are constantly calibrating their status, whether consciously or unconsciously, comparing themselves with other organizations, with other fields, with other countries, while managing internal tensions around their image and core values. Now, medicine and physics are broad, underdetermined categories, as we know, and this is one reason why, over many hundreds of years, its qualities and claims are contested. And I think the relationships between medicine and physics and science are equally tangled, as I've tried to suggest. So my argument has been that we can get a handle on such complexities not just through institutions, but through the specific ways they acquire, manage, and display their possessions, which are profoundly eloquent if historians care to listen to them. So now I have one little postscript. So in finishing, I want to stress two related points that have been implicit in what I have said. Because they can take on so many different forms, paintings turned into busts and prints, for example, as you saw, items of visual and material culture can become tentacular, reaching into many cultural niches, including the home. Now, key to the processes that I have discussed here is repetition, placing a precious image of Harvey in as many places as possible, for instance. So Harvey's image, owned by the Royal College of Physicians, became a template, including for fridge magnets and for a mug. And you can see there on the side how their coat of arms is actually a very important part of their identity, and how they design products for sale, I think is very revealing. So I want to suggest to you that although these may not look very serious, but that these too are forms of collecting and display that are of interest to historians. Thank you very much.